Please call the roll. Here.
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 Rob Beckner.
Still here.
Dana Hollinger.
Here.
Henry Jones.
Here.
And Ron Lynn.
Excused. Okay, thank you very much. Executive report, Matt Jacobs.
Good afternoon, Chair Slayton and other board members. We've got a very aggressive agenda this afternoon. We're going to start with an update on the board education policy and then move on to discussion to try to get a consensus on an adjustment to the travel policy, and then move on to the frequency of meetings and board member behavior, as well as moving on, if we get that far, to selection of future committee meetings. And for purposes of public comment and the Bagley-Keene Act, let me make clear that number 6, all of those items are a single agenda item.
Very good. Thank you so much. Now we'll move to action consent items, approval of the minutes of the last meeting. Do I hear a motion? Okay. Motion from Bilbrey, second from Jones. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. The information consent is the annual calendar review. Will actually come back, and that will probably be a topic when we get to the issue of future items. So we'll move to item 5, update on the board education policy, and Stossball.
Great, thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. This is an update on the board education policy, and more specifically, the new legislative requirement that went into effect January of this year. And this is just an information item. It's listed under action, but it's just information. So the statute requires, just to remind you, that the board establish an education policy, which you've done, and then it requires that each board member take 24 hours or undergo 24 hours of education in every 2-year cycle. And this also covers designees, board member designees. The statute also requires that CalPERS maintain a record of the education and that we post annually the policy, the board's policy, as well as a report of completed training on our website, which we're planning to do in March, coming March, and that would be the first report. So to facilitate compliance, and this is a little bit of an evolving process, we've identified 12 hours for the calendar year 2015 that we think would reasonably qualify under the statute. And just to note, it doesn't have to be 12 hours each year. It's 24 hours for each 2-year period, but it seems easier to think of it in these 12-hour chunks. So we've identified 12 hours. That's attachment B in your materials, and all of those have been videotaped so that you could watch them online. I think most of you were actually present at all the sessions, but maybe some of the designees weren't, so you could watch those. And then other courses could also qualify to meet the requirement, but the board hasn't yet set a process yet for determining what other courses or events might qualify to meet the criteria. So in anticipation of the posting on the website in March, we've been tracking the 12-hour sessions listed on the attachment. And then we're also going to provide to all of you a form that you could use for self-certification if you choose to view it online. We'll put that in the resource center on the board books. And then we thought what we would do is in December, we'll bring you the proposed format that we'll use for the online posting and give you an update on your attendance at the various sessions for your tracking purposes. And we can talk about it more in December, how you want to proceed and get comments on that. I also thought what would be helpful in December would be to get input from you all on what topics you might like us to put together for 2016. That concludes my presentation.
Okay. Ms. Mather.
Just a quick question. There may be certain sessions that certain board members may not have been able to attend in person. If they then watch the video, that qualifies, I assume, as participating in education. Is that true, accurate,
yes,
or not?
That's how we set it up, and there's we have a self-certification form designed
Perfect.
that you could use for that purpose.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Bilbrey.
So on the other, like attending, like NC PERS had a thing for board members to attend, a trustee training. How are we in the process of figuring out how we would count those, or have we talked about it, or do we hope to get something in place before the end of the 2 years that we can count those type of activities?
I'd say yes, we should get something in place, and we should start talking about it, possibly in December. I want to bring it up today to remind you that it's something you need to talk about. The board, I think the committee or the board needs to have a conversation about how you want to do that. Do you want each board member to decide on his or her own, or do you want to have some subset or the board, make a decision about which types of classes or conferences would qualify? I think the important thing is that you talk about it and come to a reasonable conclusion about how you want to proceed, and then we can track it.
Other comments or questions? Mr. Johnson. And then Mr. Johnson.
On the other, we do need to figure out some way to capture that, and it may wind up being certification or self-certification, because for some people a particular conference may actually be a valuable educational event, and for others, because of their background, it could be more of a boondoggle really than an educational event. And I'm not quite sure how you balance that out. But we need to figure out some way to deal with it.
Mr. Jones?
No, it's okay.
Okay. So what I hear is we need to have another conversation about this, and will give us time to be thinking about this between now and December. Maybe we'll put this on the agenda in December for a conversation about how we structure this part of it. But I think we are, at least from the conversation so far, leaning toward a self-certification process, probably for those other educational elements that people wish to report. And then we just need to decide whether it's just stacked here at the office or whether there's some approval process that happens. So if there's no objection, we'll take that up in December. Is that okay? For the record, I wanted to note also, I forgot when we were taking roll that Ms. Mather, Mr. Gillahan, Mr. Jelensik, and Ms. Elliott, representing the Treasurer's Office, are also in attendance. So, okay, we'll move to item number 6, travel policy, frequency meetings, board member behavior, and topics for future meetings. So I ask we'll go first to the travel policy. I think we can deal with that fairly quickly, hopefully. By the way, Mr. Klausner is on the line for some of the subsequent items, not for the travel item, so he'll be commenting in a moment. But let's move to the travel policy. At the last meeting, it became very clear there was pretty much consensus that we wanted to keep the process of approval for out-of-state or travel that exceeded a registration of $500 as the decision of the board president to be the gatekeeper for that. That seemed to be the consensus. And there was also discussion about the possibility of some kind of an appeal process, which we didn't get very far in the conversation, but it was mentioned by a couple people and as kind of a way of overruling or getting a different decision. I've thought about that over the time period, and I have a suggestion to the committee, and then this will open up the discussion, hopefully, is that one thing we could do is that in the travel policy, which was included in your materials, there's a paragraph, and I'm talking about C1, Guidelines for Considering Travel Requests under approval, where when we delegate to the president, we delegate with some instructions. And those instructions are, and I would point you to the second sentence of that paragraph, except for publicly noticed meetings or workshops of the CalPERS board, it will normally be the case that no more than 2 board members will be given approval to travel to any single event held outside of California. So that's what we've said. We've charged the president and given him that guideline. And after talking with a couple of people, I came up with the concept that if we modified that, that might eliminate the need for the appeal process by giving a little more flexibility to the president. So the suggestion is that that be modified to say something like that normally fewer than a quorum of this board would be given approval to travel to any single event. And that would give flexibility to the president to be a little more flexible on approving travel. So that's the suggestion, and now let's have a conversation. President Fechner.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I totally agree with that. My only comment would be to not put ourselves in a box, but if we're going to put down the quorum, that's a quorum of the board, so nobody misconstrues that with a quorum of a committee. That's the problem we ran into before. So the quorum of the board is always going to be 7. So we know that we can't go above that. But if you had a committee of 5, sometimes people said, well, now you can't have more than 3 people. So that's where kind of that problem came about for us.
Yeah, I was suggesting the words quorum of the board. And again, the words say normally be the case. So it doesn't mean that there couldn't be an exception to it, but there would have to be a significant reason for it. Other comments?
Yeah.
Mr. Johnson.
Some of these conferences, I'm not sure it really would make sense to say, let's send, 6 people. I mean, some of these, sometimes the educational content is such that maybe 2 or 3 makes more sense. And so I'm not quite sure how you balance that, other than maybe, if a whole bunch of people are going to want to go to an event that has relatively low content because it's in Laguna Niguel, the board president can at least say, hey, do you really think we ought to be sending 5 people? Or it could be we could take the travel off the consent calendar and have a discussion about, does it really make sense to send this many people to this particular conference? It's just something we kind of have to balance.
Well, I would say that, Mr. Fechner.
I just want to add that in the time that I've been president, I think the only times that there have been requests for more than a number was either for ICGN or CII. And those are both very renowned conferences that certainly have merit to them. The other ones, it never seemed to be an overabundance of requests. It was always those, and those are the ones that for us, if most of you don't know, those used to be notice meetings. We could just go to those. We didn't have to have permission. So when we changed that, that's when it got convoluted. But again, the rest of the conferences that we might think about or question hasn't been the case. It's only been basically those 2, because those are the most important ones and people wanted to go. I mean, if you think about it, you strap the president by saying you can only send 2 people. It's going to take 8 years to send your entire board, and the board's going to change over that period of time. So that doesn't make a lot of sense.
Mr. Jones.
Yeah, I could support the provision that no more than a quorum of the board. But on ICGN and CII, we may want to consider reestablishing those as what you call them, meetings, I guess, notice meetings, and therefore any of the 13 board members that have an interest to attend, they could have the ability to attend those meetings if we were to reestablish those as notice meetings. The only criteria, I don't know about, we have to check with those organizations, because I know sometimes they change the policies that no more than 5 can come from one institution. So provided that that's not a hindrance, it maybe makes sense to reestablish ICGN and CII as a notice meeting.
Yeah, I think the language that is being proposed, or that's on the table, says except for publicly noticed meetings. So I think that at some point we could make a decision as a group that we want this particular CII meeting to be publicly noticed, and we could just make that individual decision.
Well, but I wasn't talking about a case by case. I was just saying make a policy decision that they are noticed, so when it comes, and then you don't have to have a discussion or debate about it.
I see. Ms. Mather?
I think Dana's been waiting to
No,
speak.
it's okay. It's, no, no, no.
I think what we heard from our general counsel last time was that even if the entire board goes, it doesn't need to be noticed as long as it's social and ceremonial and we're not actually doing business. Is that?
That's correct.
Correct.
And I was just going to add, when you commented that noticing a board hearing at CII does not make the CII meeting either legitimate or not legitimate for everybody to attend, because it's not going to be a meeting.
Right.
In the sense of having an agenda and having public comment and all of the other things that are required for there to be a quote meeting under the Bagley-Keene Act. So there you go.
Okay, so
Okay,
then all
that's
those
simple.
years, we were not,
Yeah.
we were violating Bagley.
No,
Well, that's
no,
why you always have a council to,
you weren't violating. Yeah.
so, Ms. Hollinger, did you have a comment?
Oh, only that I support what Rob said, that to change the language that as you originally, would you say a quorum?
Quorum of the board.
Quorum of the board, yeah.
So why don't, did you want to speak? Yes, sir.
Mr. Chair, if we're just going to do a little bit of cleanup in our travel policy, in addition to changing the language, there are two other sections I think we may need to consider. One would be the Political Reform Act requirements E, because the reference in here is the board member is responsible for his or her compliance with the Political Reform Act, which is correct, but it talks about,
What are you, where are
I'm
you
sorry,
talking?
on page 25 of 28. I'm just saying if we're going to be updating the travel policy to make the document consistent with what's going on E, which is the Political Reform Act, I believe we actually have a slightly different gift issue than what the Political Reform Act allows. So I would want to make sure that's consistent. And then the other is Department of Personnel Administration no longer exists. And so when you talk about the dissemination of policies, it should be updated to reflect the new designations. This is on 26 to 28 in the iPad. State and Consumer Services Agency should be renamed, and the Department of Personnel Administration is now the California HR. Anyway, if we were going to make some changes, I would suggest
We can
that.
certainly,
But I think Ms. Dosbal has something.
yes. Did you?
Yes, I think we can easily do that. We could just add some words like obligations under the Political Reform Act and other pertinent statutes, including the CalPERS gift policy or something like that.
We could. So I suggest on both of these that we bring it back in December as an action item for this, because I'm hearing consensus on both of these. We can fix them. Yes, Ms. Elliott.
Just really quickly, I don't know if this is appropriate time to mention it, but last time the Treasurer's Office brought up the idea of posting the budget for travel more regularly to be more transparent. I don't know if that's something that was squashed, if that's not on the table anymore, but I wanted to bring that back up as an option because there was some confusion around what our budget was to begin with at our table discussion, and I think that was felt throughout the rest of the table discussions as well. So just an idea from the Treasurer's Office.
Okay.
I wanted to mention that before we moved on.
Well, let's note that, and actually, let's make sure that gets on the parking lot issue,
Okay.
so we
It
can.
might be still,
Yeah, I don't think it is, but we
No.
can certainly put it on there. Mr. Schlensick?
Yeah, Matt, if I can go back to the Bagley-Keene. If the whole board is someplace and we're not going to talk about PERS stuff, then technically it's not a meeting. It doesn't have to be noticed. But there's also certain optics, and I don't know how we balance the optics versus what's legally required.
Well, it's a good point, and Mr. Fechner brought that up at the last meeting where he said he posited the situation where all the CalPERS members are at the same table because they might not know other folks at the what it is, and then it looks the optics are what they are. That's really a matter for the board to kind of figure out. I think one way to get there is this isn't really legal advice, but the concept that Mr. Slayton has put forward of having no more than a quorum certainly cuts down the potential for a negative optical situation. so that at the most you'd have 6. And then people just have to be aware, I would think, the board members need to be aware of the optics and perhaps congregate less.
Well, I mean, when I go to like CII, I prefer to look for a table where I don't know anybody, because the networking is one of the values of the meeting, and I can network with these guys more frequently than I occasionally wish. But
Okay. Well, with that, I think we have on this particular item, I think we have instructions, and we'll come back in December with these 2 changes. Let's move now to a discussion of the frequency of meetings. Yes.
Before you leave travel policy, one of the other ones that got highlighted was language, I got to admit I hadn't known it was there, was the speaker
designations. Yeah.
Speaker designations.
Yeah.
I think we ought to talk about it, because I get a lot of calls from constituent groups and ask if I can come speak to them. And if I don't have a conflict, I say yes, but I'm not sure that this policy technically says I should refer it to the president. And I'm not, so if it's a conference and somebody is coming to speak to represent CalPERS, that's one issue. If it's a member speaking to a constituent group, that's something else. And I don't know that we've actually dealt with it, and I don't know that it's ever particularly been enforced.
This is C2, page 4 of 7, under speaker designations. And I don't think it happens very often.
Yes, it does.
No, I'm not sure. I'm saying that it goes through the president, and the president determines who's
Okay.
going to. That's what I'm saying.
I thought you said that.
Oh, no. Speaker requests happen all the time,
Yeah.
but I'm not sure they follow what these words say.
I think that's what the issue is.
Yeah. Please use your microphone.
Yeah. I think as I'm interpreting what JJ said, that is the issue, because I get requests all the time from retirees to come and speak to their groups almost every month, and I feel like JJ. I don't think that's appropriate to have to go to Rob to go to speak to my constituents.
So, Rob, do you have this happening a lot?
Mike Ross.
There's only 5 of us. Request to speak for like going to constituent groups and like that? No.
Okay.
I mean, for conferences, things that people were, like I said, Dana just asked me, because she's going to a conference and they asked her to speak on some topic, so she asked me about it. I said, yeah, here, contact public affairs to get your talking points. But as far as the constituent meetings, no. I mean, that's pretty much been, everybody's been on their own. You didn't have to ask for permission to travel to those either. So constituent meetings were always held differently.
So should there be a different set of words for constituent meetings than this, or is this not applicable and should be struck? Ms. Mather.
I would just, if I could weigh in, I think that as a practical matter, generally individuals get invited to speak and not sort of somebody from the CalPERS board.
Yeah.
And so, and generally we put that on whatever our travel request that we've been requested to speak. So, and in the sense that the board president approves those travel requests, that is
Then there's a way
him, approving that.
So maybe this language is just not needed. Anybody think that the language is needed? Okay, well then let's. Almost got through it. Almost got through it.
I don't think we need this specific language, but I think we need language somewhere that says that if you're requested to speak, that you notify the organization. So we know when you're speaking, someone's speaking on behalf of CalPERS, but I don't think we need to give permission to do that. We just need to have the information so everyone knows.
Is that reasonable? Mr. Gillihan and then Mr. Talinsky.
I don't really play in this world too often, because when I get asked to speak, it's usually as a director of CalHR, not as a CalPERS board member. But sometimes I mention something about PERS or pension issues, more about pension issues rather than CalPERS per se. But it seems like that should be the distinction. If you're somebody who's going out to speak to a group, as representing CalPERS or just because you happen to be a board member and you're going out expressing your own opinion, your own views of the world? And that seems to me where you would need to notify CalPERS that you're going to go speak as a board member of CalPERS versus in your other capacity or capacities.
Well, Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, and one of the, I think he's made a valid observation. Sometimes you are speaking as CalPERS, and other times you're speaking as somebody who happens to be a CalPERS member. But one of the things that I think we ought to adopt as a practice and maybe even a rule is, if somebody from the SEC goes to speak, they've got that little thing that says
disclaimer.
This is me, this is not. And I think maybe we need to develop something like that and get people to use that. And quite frankly, I think maybe they ought to use it even if it's speaking to a constituent group, just to reinforce that they're not speaking for CalPERS.
Well, Mr. Jones.
I disagree with that because when I go out to speak to retirees, I am speaking on behalf of CalPERS. That's the whole reason I'm there, is they want to know what's going on with their pension fund. And if I were to say that I'm speaking on these are my own thoughts, et cetera, I mean, that's not going to work.
Well, we may cover this issue in another topic later in the agenda. So, but I understand your point about that you most of the time you are speaking on behalf of CalPERS as a board member, and the thoughts that you express are considered to be thoughts.
Because that's where I'm getting my
coming.
information from,
Yeah.
I'm not making up stuff.
And I concur with Mr. Jones because when I go to speak, I'm like you. I have talking points provided to me
And
from
CalPERS
and that's
staff
what I'm
prepared
using to talk about. So it is definitely on behalf of CalPERS.
Well, the one thing I do hear some consensus on is making sure that if you are asked that replacing this, maybe we change the title from speaker designations to something else, but speaker notification, that in fact, if you are asked to speak, that CalPERS needs to know about it. And that's reasonable. And I think the rest of it gets to be procedural, and I'm not sure it needs to be embedded in a policy. Ms. Dossbaugh.
Yeah, thanks. Just for the drafting. So when you say CalPERS needs to know about it, I think we should, is it you notify the board president or you
notify the board president.
Okay, thank you.
What? Ms. Mather?
Sorry. I mean, I guess maybe it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other, but typically I would email the Brad Pacheco and maybe Rob's office too. So I guess the question is, who really needs? What would be the easiest from a practical standpoint?
Yeah. In another policy, and I don't recall which one right now. I think it's in your governance policy. It says that if a board member is asking for talking points, it's supposed to go through the board president and the board services unit.
Okay.
But I
think that's why you do that.
I would suggest if you're asked to speak, that the two people that need to know about it are the CEO and the president. And if they know, then they can circulate it wherever it needs to go beyond that for whatever purpose is needed.
Perfect.
Yeah. I mean, it's just process.
Right.
It's just process because I'm in LA, and Friday morning the members said, "Could you come and speak to us on Monday morning?" And I go.
Right.
And now, how Rob knows and how Ann knows, because I sent something to Brett, I got an urgent matter, I need a talking point. And then Rob's office get it because my talking points come back through his special assistant. So his office is aware. And then if their mileage that I'm claiming, Rob approves that mileage after the fact.
Yeah.
But it's not before the fact.
Right. But just the knowledge, what does happen before the fact is they know.
Yeah.
That you're doing it. And whatever method you use to make sure they know.
So it's not an approval, it's just the request.
It's not approval.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's certainly not approval. It's just notification. And many times, a lot of us go out and speak and we don't ask for talking points.
Yeah.
Right.
So we wouldn't know any other way. So if you have that kind of situation, it's just best to notify us. It's just transparency. We need to know where everybody is.
Okay.
If you're on our business.
Mr. Jelensik, and then we're going to kind of close this up and get to the next item.
I normally do not ask for talking points, but I am really conscientious about getting it up on the board calendar.
Okay.
And I know Rob sees it, the board unit sees it, I don't know if Vance sees it, but I think if people are really conscientious about getting it up there, it would help. And
Okay.
a little comment on the board calendar would help if I didn't have to see everybody's notifications.
All right. So we have, I think we have consensus on changes to this that we'll come back in December with. And I thank you very much. It was a good, robust discussion on that. I think we made some progress. Let's move to frequency of meetings. And I've asked, this came out of an early discussion a few months ago that when Henry and I, as chair and vice chair of investments, were meeting about the calendar this year and next year's calendar, and we started to look at that, and we had a conversation with Mr. Klausner as our fiduciary counsel on the issue of frequency of meetings. And we meet right now, obviously, 12 times a year, and they're intensive and they're long, like today. So we haven't talked about that and visited the issue of how often should we meet. My only editorial comment is that our staff, which supports us in this effort, is a finite resource. So to the extent that we meet every month, plus 10 months plus 2 offsites, results in a pretty heavy use of a finite resource. And we do charge them with the job of getting some things done that are outside of the issue of board week. So with that, I thought we would kick off a discussion about that. And first, I would ask Mr. Klausner to weigh in on meeting frequency and our fiduciary responsibility, and also maybe some examples of what others do. So, Mr. Klausner, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and members of the board. I look to see what other large pension funds are doing, and I want to stop there for a second. I do realize that CalPERS is unique in terms of its size and its scope and the population that it serves. So I tried to limit my look to what other funds in the top 10 size-wise in terms of population served. I happen to be in Austin, Texas at the moment, and I was with one of the folks from the Texas teachers over the weekend at the executive board meeting for NASRA, and I asked them how often they meet. And they meet 8 times a year for 2 days, and that covers their committee meetings as well. They don't do any off-sites that they do are part of that meeting schedule. And like California, they cover a large geographic area, and they serve a membership population of about 1.5 million, which is not small. And they seem able to accomplish that. They have a smaller staff than you do. My observation is that there's no magic number. I will tell you that there are retirement boards that meet weekly, and which is mind-boggling for me, and they manage to make it last all day, 52 times a year, and they are one of our clients, and I have recommended less frequent meetings. But I don't think to get the job done has anything to do with the meetings. I did watch quite a bit of the last couple of days because I wanted to be ready for yesterday if needed on the investment committee. And a lot of what you got was informational. And the question is, to what extent does the receipt of this information, in the absence of a specific action item, need to take place in the context of a board meeting? And that's what led me to believe I think it is possible for you to meet less frequently. The amount of staff time that must be taken to, you meet 36 days a year. If you effectively cover 3 days, including your offsites 12 times a year, means, like 9% of the year you're in a meeting. And that absorbs a tremendous amount of the time of your staff. Now, on the other side of that equation, I think it is important that the staff gets face time, for lack of a better term, with the board so that they're efforts on behalf of the system and its members can be appreciated by the people to whom they report. And I think that is important. But I think that's an event which could be accelerated perhaps at the off-site meetings, whereas the business meetings could perhaps be shorter. I mean, all of you have other stuff to do. And when the staff is engaged in preparing for the meetings, which I know takes a great deal of preparation, it's not just 20 minutes before the 3 days begins, that the staff's engaged in meeting preparation probably almost a quarter of the year, it would seem to me, based on the amount of time that must be required. And that, as the chairman observed, takes away from performing the substantive work of operating the system. I would suggest that a task for the governance committee would be to meet with the senior executive staff and try to make a better delineation as to what is informational, which perhaps could be done outside of a meeting or even in the educational context, that you could get some of the information along with the education that you are statutorily required to receive, as opposed to items which the board or the committees of the board must act upon based on a statutory mandate. So the answer is, I think you could do it with less than 12. So that would be my advice.
Okay, Bob, thank you very much for that commentary. And with that, I'll open it up to conversation. What do people think about how frequently we meet, and what would you like to see? Well, don't all rush at once. Mr. Johnson.
Is Bob still on the phone?
Bob, you're still on the phone, right?
I'm here till I'm
excused. Okay.
Okay. One of the things that makes us different than a lot of retirement systems is that we're both health and investments. In many cases, those are either not both included.
Need to closer to your mic.
Many times they're either not both included in the scope of the board, or they are separate boards. Some systems just don't do health, for example. And I think that complicates it somewhat. And maybe we need to think about setting meetings that kind of break those two, not just into separate committee meetings during the day, but maybe even separate schedules.
Okay. Mr. Costigan.
So I'll just give you some different observations from where I've sat on my other board, but I just want to say, in the healthcare context, Covered California meets 8 times a year, 1 day a month, over 8 months. And I believe they've got 5 million people, 6 million people inside their system. So again, if you're looking from a healthcare side, and as an entity that is looking at rewriting healthcare in California, Covered California would be close. At the State Personnel Board, and I will say there are 2 things I think that our board is a little bit does differently compared to SPB. We will spend Wednesday going through dozens of cases in a matter of minutes. Yet at SPB, we go through very complex litigation cases involving dismissals, terminations, as Ms. Hagan knows, the creation of classifications, CEAs, and we had a 6,000 case backlog when I sat on the board, when I started the board in 2007. Our goal was to reduce the number of meetings because of the effect it had on our ALJs and on our legal staff. Preparing for 2 board meetings a month. It has made our meetings longer, which has been fine, and we are still able to process it. At our last board meeting, we actually, I think, what was it, Katie, 4 CEAs, a termination hearing, full-blown 30-minute hearings. And so I think when I look at it from a staff perspective, I know how much better it has become for our staff even to have a reduction from 2 days to 1 day. While it's made that 1 day much harder, it's also made us much more efficient because it's allowed us to go through the number of cases, prioritize. We work very closely with CalHR. I do think, for example, our CEA schedule is much more efficient now. The way we do classifications are much more efficient. So I just sit there and I struggle, and I think as many of you all know, in addition to this board, SPB, and then my day job, I can fill my entire day with every meeting. So it doesn't, the vacuum fills itself, but I really look at what staff struggles with, and that's what, as Mr. Slayton, as you said, I really think in this case we almost need to defer staff. Because on the flip side, I also think it allows the other members, in the conversation we just had, Mr. Jones, you get lots of requests to go speak. It really allows you to have more priority to go out and spend time with your constituents. It actually frees up more time to give you the ability to go out and actually represent CalPERS more publicly. Probably not the right word, but we're out there more. But that's just my point, Mr. Slayton.
Mr. Delancey.
This is my ignorance about how SPB works. You said that by meeting once a month instead of twice a month, it was easier on the ALJs, and I don't understand why that would be unless you have the ALJs come to the meeting to present.
No, it actually became more efficient because it allowed us to set our board schedules. Instead of saying we have the hearing on, make our decision, we're going to hear a case, then the question is, are we going to hit the 2nd, 4th, or 6th? Some have not. Now, from a meeting schedule, they'll know it'll be the first. We've condensed the schedule. So when we send something back to the ALJ, rather than saying we want to see it in 2 weeks or we want to see it in 4 weeks, they've got a 4-week period to prepare for it. It also allows us to pace our calendar flow because of the number of hearings we have to do. And so the feedback that we were getting back, because again, as we read through these and we tinker with the decisions, our goal, particularly slightly different than what CalPERS goes through, is for every day that there's the delay with our board, there's the potential the costs go up to the state. Because if we're going to do a reinstatement, by the time a case gets to the board, it's taken 3 years for its way to work its way through.
Let's not get too deep
anyway,
into the weeds.
But in response to his
Yeah.
question, so I was just saying.
I know. I understand. Other comments? Yes, Ms. Hollinger.
I think it's, for me, maybe because I haven't been on the board as long, I would need input from staff because I don't know, honestly, from their perspective, how much it's necessary that we're here monthly to accomplish or whatever input they may or may not need from us. Could it be done less? So I really, I don't know if you want to table this or put it in the parking lot, as you suggest, with staff to get their insight as to, I would just need their input.
How it could work.
How it could work.
Ms. Tosball.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you. First, you've talked about, some people have talked about the stress on the staff of the meeting schedule, and I mean, that is a factor. I don't know, it's hard to quantify, but I'm guessing we spend 50, your senior leadership probably spends 50, 60, 70% of our time meeting, getting ready for the next meeting, reviewing the materials. So by having your leadership spend that much time, you're detracting significantly from the time spent on business planning, strategic thinking, for a very big, complicated organization. So that's one loss. And then another thing I was just thinking about is that often the board has asked that we try to streamline the materials. And we almost don't have time. The churn is so fast that we don't even really have time to think about that. So I really think that if we met less frequently, and we're not talking about anything drastic, that you'd probably see a pretty substantial improvement in the quality of the materials that you get and in the thinking behind it. I really believe that.
Well, here's, yes.
I just wanted to add that Mr. Gillihan and I have talked about this a little bit, and we're both very much in support of reducing the number of meetings per year. And I can say, having, I think I hold a unique position in that I contributed to the meetings at one point, and then now I'm on the other end reading all of the materials every month. And I actually have a couple of staff that help interpret all of that information because I don't have time in my day job to do all that reading. So I see both sides of it, and just listening to comments too from board and staff, it can be wearing. And I think that I'm really happy that this discussion is happening, but I also think it's going to be a big culture change because then we're in a position where we have to make tough decisions on what comes before us, right? So we're going to have to start making a not to do list or not to, I do like, was it Mr. Klausner's comment about maybe looking at more educational opportunities? Since we just talked about the board education policy, it seemed like a big chunk of yesterday's private equity discussion was very educational to me. So maybe we can start thinking in that way.
Yeah, what I'm hearing, and particularly what Ms. Hollinger said, that maybe what we should do, because we don't have a lot of time today, but to ask staff to go back and think about this and come back in December with maybe some options, because they're the ones who have to kind of look and arrange and work on the calendar. And while they're doing that, they may have contact with committee chairs, with the president, and see what's possible. What are some options? And then we can look at those options and kind of see what we like or what we don't like, or if we don't like any of it. So that would be my suggestion, is to charge the staff to come up with some plan designs that would be for 2016 and see what we like. Mr.
Sorry,
Johnson.
we don't have time to do that.
Make time. Mr. Johnson.
I think getting the staff input would be a really good idea. But one of the things I would like staff to think about while they are developing that input is, and it's an issue I've raised numerous times that you're probably getting bored with, we get a lot of information or a lot of data, not necessarily much information. When we get a proposal, we get all the reasons we ought to do something. We don't get the reasons we shouldn't do it. We don't get what the other options were. And I know from my experience on staff, they've had those discussions. But as a result, we get, this is what you ought to do, and here's why you ought to do it. And we tend to make poorly informed decisions. I don't think we necessarily make bad decisions, but they're poorly informed. So as they're thinking about it, I would like them to think about how they can get more of that pro and con into it.
Well, I think what
PCA talked about the skeptics memo. I mean, maybe we need skeptics memos with these agenda items.
Well, I think what you're suggesting is really ties in with what Ms. Stossball said and some of the rest of us, which is, and Mr. Clauser, it's getting down to the essence of good information that we need to make good decisions. And giving them more time to work on that hopefully results in a more succinct meeting that is more focused and more based on the particular information that we need to make good decisions in our governance of the organization. So I think it goes hand in hand. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw coming out of this, hopefully, an improvement in both the information we get and the decision making. So I don't hear any objection to going ahead and charging staff with this as well. Is that okay?
Yeah, we'd be delighted. Thank you.
Okay, very good.
And Bill, if I may add a little bit to it. We had one situation, and I don't even remember what it was, where staff and the consultant didn't work out their disagreement. And so both options got laid out in front of the board. And it was actually one of the better discussions we had, because we were talking about the issue, not the rubber stamp.
Okay. Well, again, that's the kind of thing that would come out of this, we would hope. Let's move to the next item, which is listed as board member behavior. And I want to make some comments before we start that discussion. This is a result of several people putting it on the parking list and wanting to talk about this and having a frank conversation. We're 13 board members, and some have designees who come from different backgrounds and have different constituencies and different views on how to weigh their loyalty to the organization and their meeting their fiduciary responsibility. And I think that we have some disagreements about how we should be doing that and what the rules of the road should be. And I think it's important for us to have a conversation about this so that we can make sure that we all get a chance to express what we think are the right ways for us to support this organization and deliver our fiduciary responsibility. So again, I would like to invite Mr. Klausner to weigh in on this particular topic as well. And so if you have some initial thoughts, Bob, that would be helpful.
I do. I think one of the hardest things that collegial groups have to do is deal with the fact that you're not 13 individuals when you're acting together, but you're one. And that opinions should be openly expressed at meetings, and there certainly should not be censorship. But once the body has reached a decision, that's the decision. And if you want to raise it in an appropriate parliamentary procedure for review, or you want to bring it back, and whenever you bring things back for review because you think there's a better mousetrap to be built, then all of that is appropriate. But there are times when members of a collegial body just don't like the answer and then go off on their own in a manner which is detrimental to the unified view, or at least the majority view, that the body has adopted for the benefit of the agency. And CalPERS could not be more. I read the CalPERS news clips every day, and just starting out on the board, you can't win, because as you go through the articles, one says, CalPERS lowers investment outlook, going to cost taxpayers billions, and the next one says, CalPERS rides it easy and doesn't want to, make smart investment decisions to make money. So either, there's no right answer. The point is, though, you do reach answers, and I've watched through the meetings your deliberations and the fact that you do come eventually to a decision. And usually after, at least from my observation, is pretty careful thought. Once you've done that, then the mission is to move forward and implement the policy. If after the implementation of the policy you've discovered it's not working, or it was the wrong decision, and it happens for everybody, then you go back and you take another look at it. You don't say, because I or a group of I's don't like what the majority did, that I'm going to take some action externally that undermines the effective view. That is contrary to your fiduciary duty. Forgive the lecture.
That's what we ask you. That's what I ask you to do. So it's okay. So let's have some discussion about this, Mr. Jones.
Yeah, I have a couple of instances that I think that is worthy of having a discussion of, and that's for board members to disparage staff in a public forum. I don't think, even if you are with those cards, you say these the views I'm expressing are my own. I don't even think that's appropriate to disparage staff, because these are the individuals that work for the organization, and the majority of the board feels that they're doing a good job. But I don't think there should be some consequences for individuals making disparaged statements about staff, number one. Number two, I think that as was indicated, if we make a decision as a body, I think if someone violates that decision, there needs to be some kind of consequence. Because right now, there's no consequence. If an individual, and I'm speaking specifically about the Public Records Act requests, that if we had already made a decision, then you shouldn't use another process to go around that decision to get what you want and then use it in a way that may not be as beneficial to the institution as a whole. So those are a couple right off the bat that I think we need to, if it happens, we need to have some kind of policy where there's some strong consequences to avoid that kind of thing from happening. Because, if staff is disparaged and then they go out in the marketplace and they're representing CalPERS, and their job is to get the best returns they can for us, but if their abilities are mitigated because of now the broader community believes that they're incompetent, then they can't do their job to get us the best returns that we need. So those are a couple comments I have.
So before others speak, Mr. Klausner, he's raised two issues, and one being making a Public Records Act request, and the other one is, disparagement of staff in public. Do you have any commentary about that as it relates to our fiduciary responsibility?
I do. I was actually holding up my hand.
I could tell.
I thought you could. I want to start with this disparaging of the staff. When we did the educational program at the offsite in January, if I left you with what that I thought that I believed was really important to take home, it was that you, the board, have a single employee. CalPERS has thousands of employees. You have one. And if you're not happy with what any of the other 3,000 employees do, don't take it up with them. Don't disparage them. Take it up with the CEO. And I know that the president is in the office on a continuing basis, and you can either take it up with the president or take it up with the CEO, but you shouldn't. I think disparaging the employees is both wrong from a fiduciary standpoint because you are undermining their effectiveness. I was aware that a number of large retirement systems like yours are opening offices in various places in the world because they think they can get better private equity deals if they're in Asia or in Europe or somewhere. And your investment staff has taken a fairly substantial whipping in the public marketplace by others. And, it's free speech out there, so everybody who's got a blog or whatever is free to do that. But if the staff is dissatisfied and you don't feel you're getting accountability, or you don't feel like the work is up to the level that is expected of the nation's largest public pension system, then you need to take it up with Ann. And if the executive director's response to a problem of magnitude isn't good, then your problem's in the chief executive's office, not with that individual employee. So that's item number one. And number two, with the Public Records Act request, it's a little more complicated. Every person can request any record that's a public record. I know that, we have one board member who, because of an attorney general's or two attorney general opinions, is limited in certain aspects of his ability to participate in certain decision making of the fund. Well, she's the AG's the chief legal officer of the state, and it would be unwise to deviate from that opinion unless a court overruled it. But to then say, because I'm not getting something, that's another one of those things where if a member feels they're being denied information, you need to take it up with the president, or you need to take it up with the director, or you need to take it up at a meeting as an agenda item and say, as a trustee, I should be provided with X, and I'm not getting X. And how can we approve my ability as a trustee to get information that I need to do that? To go through the Public Records Act or ask somebody else to do it, I think it undermines, again, the effectiveness of the mission of the board as a whole, and I don't think that's consistent with good fiduciary practice.
Bob, let me ask you a question about that, just to dig a little deeper. So let's suppose someone feels they need more information and takes it up with the CEO to no avail, takes it to the president to no avail, gets it on an agenda, and the rest of the board says, the 12 of us don't agree that you need that to be able to exercise your fiduciary responsibility. Now what?
I thought about that. Legally, the individual has the right to ask for the information. The public records law stands by itself. Public records laws throughout the country are probably the single most litigated issue for any governmental entity, pension funds and everybody else, because we live in an information age, and we also live in an age where everybody knows everybody else's business. That aside, I don't know that you can prevent, I do not believe you can legally prevent someone from doing that. Now, whether the manner in which the record is requested or the disruption that it may cause the agency, otherwise interferes with fiduciary duty, then there comes a time when, on a case-by-case basis, I think the board and perhaps me, if I'm asked, or the general counsel's office is going to have to look at whether the exercise of what is apparently a statutory right interferes with a voluntary obligation that you've taken on to yourself to be a fiduciary of the system. And I think that may be where the real difference lies. If you're just a citizen, you can ask for whatever is not otherwise protected by some confidential statute that the legislature has determined. And it's your right to read it no matter what. But if the exercise of that right is inconsistent with an obligation that you've taken on for yourself, then it may, in fact, even though the exercise of the request is legal, it may be a deviation from good fiduciary practice or the standard of care accepted by a fiduciary. Nobody makes any one of you be a trust. Well, some of you have to by ex officio, but for the most part, trustees on the system agreed to serve, whether they were asked or whether they stood for election because they wanted to. Whatever brings you to the board. Once you're here, your constituency is irrelevant, and you act as a collegial body. And when you deviate from that group concept that you do not make decisions individually, then you undermine your mission as a whole. So the answer is it legal to ask for anything? Yeah, I think it is statutorily. Is in every context, is it good fiduciary practice if the system has decided otherwise? I think the answer is no.
Okay. Other comments? Ms. Mather.
May I just, first I'd like to ask Mr. Klausner a clarifying question. So even if something is legal, if the board considers it to be contrary to the board's fiduciary duty to have one of its members submitting a PRA request around sort of a board to circumvent a board decision, can recourse be taken? Can action be taken?
I don't know. It's something I'd want to think about. The question is, can the lawful exercise of a individual, you don't even need to be a citizen, I was going to say a citizen, but you don't need to be a person, to access to what is a public record, deviate from your voluntary acceptance of fiduciary duty. And if that's the case, maybe. But it's one I'd really like to think about, and I'll certainly be prepared to report back to you when you have your quarterly meeting.
So then if you...
Thank you. Which quarter meeting? Yeah. Ms. Mather. Yeah.
If I may, Mr.
Yes,
Chair,
please.
just a couple other things. So I wholeheartly agree with what Mr. Jones raised around disparaging staff in a public forum, and that being, I'm glad to hear Mr. Klausner's response to that. But I think also so a couple of other issues I would like to raise are around disparaging the board, either in the press or otherwise, and also just generally releasing work product or working documents and other information that is not available to the public through our regular public meetings or other public fora to the press or otherwise.
Okay, good point. Mr. Jelensik held up his hand, and then Mr. Koster.
Okay, as the PRA guy that we're talking about, when we had just the one lobbyist, Thomas here, he did a weekly report, and I got a copy of it. He sent me a copy. When we went to 3 lobbyists, I said I wanted to see what they were doing for us. Most of the board decided they didn't want to see it. And that's fine. As I said, I'm not asking any of you to read it. I want to see it. Was told I couldn't. I asked for a copy of the contract. The contract specifically says this report is a public record. So I asked for it again. Was told I couldn't have it. I did a public records request. I got it. Pointed out that I wanted to keep getting it, and I think one of the board members said, shouldn't be a problem now. But it turned out it was a problem, so I did a second public records request. And at that point, staff said, you can have it. You know, you're entitled. It's a public record, you can have it. It's easier for us if we just automatically send it to you, and that's fine. I don't know that I've ever shared one of those, but I do value knowing what our lobbyists are doing. When Tom was the only lobbyist, I actually shared that pretty regularly because it was informative and a lot of people enjoyed it. I'm not asking that any of you read it, but it is a public record, and I think it helps me understand what we're doing if I know what our lobbyist is doing. And so that's why I asked for it, and now I get it routinely, and that's sort of where it's at. So yeah, those are my comments on the public record.
Mr. Costigan.
Okay, so I guess I'll take them in reverse order, the disparaging. So I agree, we should never disparage staff in public. And I'm going to look at Ms. Hagan while I say this, because I'm not disparaging you. There is a fine line, as Ms. Hagan knows, in my other role, between disparaging and making personal attacks and aggressive questioning and making a point. I know that y'all can find it shocking, but there are times I can go overboard on making a point, which I recently did, which was not. So I want to say it's very cautious, because I don't believe in that case I disparaged. I was just very aggressive in my question. So I don't want us to get it. I find it hard from the standpoint, personal attacks, yes. I don't know how you become the arbitrator of speech, depending on. So I mean, I think we have to have a further discussion on that. But I agree, personal attacks on staff. It should always be about public policy and about the underlying issue. That you should always default to that. The concern I have with PRAs is what the P stands for, is public. I'm surprised that we're having this discussion. I don't know if this becomes a transparency, a posting issue, or what the case may be. On one hand, I find the fact that a PRA is being submitted by a board member very uncomfortable and very disturbing. That shouldn't be the case, that a board member would have to submit a document. On the other is, I don't know how you make the document available. The key here is it's a public record. If it's available to the public, it should be accessible. And I don't know at that point how that document becomes, because what I've heard is it's not a privileged document from our lobbyist. Is that correct? There's nothing in that document that's privileged, as I look at Mr. Jacobs.
I don't think I've been asked that question before, but
But if it's being produced subject to a PRA, then there's nothing privileged in it.
presumably, that's correct.
So
Can I add?
I'm struggling from the standpoint of I don't think having a monthly PRA is appropriate. On the other is I don't know how you get the information out there. So I know that's a governance issue. That's why I just throw it out there. Is the key, and also from a staff standpoint, I don't know what other document. As I look at the PRA reports that come in monthly, it's kind of like back to the number of board meetings we have. PRAs are also an effective tool to slow down organizations, because you just paper people to death to get them to produce documents, document after document after document, as opposed to what does the database look like. And I just don't know if that's an issue from a governance or a resource issue to make documents more available as we move back to Ms. Mather's point about becoming more transparent. So thank you.
Ms. Mather.
If I understand it correctly, in this particular instance, the reports were actually informal emails between our representatives and our staff that now have to be formalized in order to be responsive to Mr. Jelinsik's requests, so that they are in a form that can be digested in a public manner. So to me, this is actually making more work for the staff, and we get very regular reports from our federal representatives, which is why the board as a whole decided that we didn't want these to be provided on a weekly basis.
So let me just interrupt for a second and get Mr. Klausner to weigh in on this kind of an issue where let's assume for the moment that the board decided we really don't want to burden staff with having to distribute the weekly emails for our lobbyists, and that the monthly report should be sufficient for us to be able to have the information to perform our fiduciary responsibility. But we have one board member who disagrees with that. So help me understand how to resolve how we should resolve that kind of an issue.
I don't think the public, and I can stand corrected on this by your general counsel, but the Public Records Act, I do not believe, requires you to create a document. It says that if you have a document, you got to produce it. And if, in fact, you have a series of emails where people talk to each other and the effect of Public Records Act, as I think it was Mr. Koskinen said, papers an agency and, slows it to a crawl, is it's actually restrains people from now sending emails, which is often an efficient way to communicate because it's not like you don't have to chase somebody to get them on the phone. I think this is a serious governance issue for the board to deal with because I think this has much bigger consequences and a much bigger application than simply the issue of whether what the lobbyist is talking about informally with somebody at staff. And then it has to turn into a document that incorporates all this information. As I understand it, some of what the lobbyist does is to negotiate a position for you or to advocate a position for you or to thread some difficult political issue for you. We had a whole discussion we had a small discussion yesterday about divestment, and that's going to continue to be a bigger issue where lobbying will be important, and the ability to develop a strategy is going to be impaired if the staff's work essentially out there. And so I would really task the committee, and I'll be happy to work on it with the general counsel or the CEO or whoever you want me to work with it on, and the chairman, to try to better isolate or better define what are the component pieces of the business of the agency that standing alone don't inform, as opposed to the summary of the information which all the trustees should be regularly informed about. I guess some people don't want, some people want to know what the components of SALT are, and I get that. Everybody thinks differently. But to the extent that that's impeding the operation of the system, there has to be a better way to do this. And I am very sensitive about transparency. Transparency is something that government has an obligation to do, but in some instances impairs government's obligation. It impairs government's ability to perform the mission which the public has asked it to perform. So I think dealing with this in the abstract is almost a little bit like a theological discussion, but I really think it warrants the effort to take the opinions that have been expressed today and try to put them into a usable, manageable policy.
Ms. Hollinger?
It was actually something I wrote a note to myself last October about when I looked at your governance policy and avoid secrets.
I don't really understand all the facts and circumstances, but it seems to me if JJ wanted certain information, he should have had access to it. And maybe going forward so he could make his decisions. But where I do have an issue, and I think as fiduciaries and as trustees, we have to uphold the integrity of the organization, which means not disparaging it publicly. Treating each other with dignity and respect, and staff as well. I do think going forward that I know if we don't act in our fiduciary capacity, Bob, typically there are consequences, and maybe I think it's something that we have to have on the table to ensure better behavior going forward, and just standards. And also that we respect the confidentiality of information that we do have access to. I mean, and when you and that we don't leak information to the press, that it wasn't a board decision to disclose.
Well, you know, the with disclosure is not ultimately what you did, because your business in the end, for the most part, is public. It's that if a half-developed thought gets released, it'll prevent the fully developed thought from ever being born, because Benjamin Franklin said thinking out loud was dangerous, and I happen to agree with him.
Right.
And I think that's what happens when the individual email communications that lead to the development of a policy or a thought find their way outside of the building before it's a fully developed thought. That's why drafts are generally not, you know, you could never throw a piece of paper away. If you wrote a note on a piece of scratch paper, you could never throw it away. The idea is that the public's business should be done in the public, and the manner in which the public agency expresses its policy should be known to the public. It is not, in my view, intended to impede the free exchange of thoughts and ideas in order to develop and implement the policy by the policymakers. And that's where the development of the really the code of behavior that you just discussed, in my view, should focus.
So my takeaway from this is that, you know, we have an issue of working papers, of things the staff is working on to be, and this may not fall in that category. This lobbyist thing may not hit that particular mark. But I think that we need to be cautious about the work in progress that the staff is doing, and to try to keep ourselves out of that work in progress until those thoughts are fully developed. I'm not sure where to take this, but I think we need to think about it more. I think it's worth cogitating. So why don't we do that?
Can I make a suggestion, Mr. Chairman?
Sure.
Perhaps create with the staff and yourself a working group to help try to bring this to a more developed thought. And I would ask the General Counsel also for some more specific guidance to the committee on limitations related to the Public Records and Open Meetings Act, so that we observe our legal responsibility, but at the same time permit the agency the discretion that the law does provide it to develop a thought before it, you know, comes out of the shell.
Okay. Mr. Jelensik, and then we need to move on to other topics.
The contract that the board approved has a number of products. One is the monthly report, which we get and is put in agenda committees. It has a weekly report. That is a product of the contract, and it says it's a public record. Then there are interim emails, phone calls, contacts, because stuff doesn't necessarily happen on a weekly basis. Those, quite frankly, are not identified as public record. I've never asked for them.
Mr. Jelensik, I already made the comment that this may not fit the criteria, so I don't think we need to, you know, go through the detailed gyrations at this point, but I do think that maybe it doesn't fit the category we're talking about. But the category we are talking about is very important, and we need to be sure to pay attention to it. There's one other topic on this particular category that I'd like to at least get a couple of thoughts, and then we'll very quickly do the issues in the parking lot, and that is the time management that we do as a board, and our need for restraint as individual board members to be respectful of each other's time, the amount of time we actually take up in asking questions, in making commentary, and maybe this falls in the category of a need for better meeting management by chairs of committees. But it's something that I've observed where if we have one board member dominating with questions and commentary, it takes up the time that others could participate. And we just all need to be very respectful of each other's time as we go through meetings. But if anybody has a comment about that, but I do think maybe it delves into meeting management. Mr. Bilbrey.
So we have briefings for a reason. And usually in those briefings, you ask questions, and questions are answered. And of course, sometimes there are questions that will come out of that between the briefing and the meeting. But when you ask questions in a briefing and you are answered to those questions, I don't understand why those same questions have to be answered again in an open meeting, just because there's two different situations. I mean, I think that's where half of the questions sometimes come again and waste our time. When you've already asked them, either in the briefing or at any time, staff has made it abundantly clear, if there's ever a question, don't hesitate to ask. And in whatever it may be, I think we have lots of opportunities to ask questions, and they don't always have to be in an open setting. I don't know, sometimes the idea is that, others may have that question or others may want to know the answer. Well, there's a lot of opportunities for people to ask questions. So I don't always think that it has to be these repeated questions all the time.
Any other comments? Yes.
I just
Ms.
had
Hagan.
one suggestion perhaps for going forward. In the board governance policy, section 10 discusses board member roles, responsibilities, and conduct. And there's 10 sort of bullet points on behavior. And I think there's a few things missing. So we might want to take a stab at maybe updating that language to cover some of what's been discussed today.
Is that in our board book?
Yes, in the resources section with the policies.
So maybe I can get some thoughts from you afterwards of things that you think ought to be, and we can do that offline.
Sure.
And adjust that. Mr. Schlentzing.
And Michael, I ask lots and lots of questions in the briefings, less given the change in the format. And most of those actually get answered in the presentation. And, if they get answered in the presentation, I don't re-ask them. And I actually would just as soon have them answer the question in the presentation because it makes a more informed discussion. But I think if you talk to most staff, they will tell you I'm really pretty good about trying to identify what the questions I have are.
Okay. Yeah, we do actually have meeting management by committee chairs as one of the items on the parking lot, which we could talk about. So are there items on here left to my own discretion? I'll pick items for the next meeting in addition to those that we've already charged staff with to come back with in December. But are there particular things that are on this list or not on this list that you want us to talk about in governance? By the way,
Bill?
We do have some resolved issues list. We've actually accomplished some things. So we'll always put that list in too, so we feel like we're moving forward. Ms. Hollinger.
Yeah, I just think that the issues that we brought up today with the recent one from Katie, updating, I don't know, you want to, a couple of, oh God, I lost my train of thought. Must be the time. But with where she said in the board,
Section 10?
The Section 10, that could be something that we deal with. And then before that, with Bob, on our thoughts going forward regarding information and conduct and consequences.
Okay. Let me mention one item that's on this list because I'd like to do it talk about it in December, but I want to see if there's still the same level of interest. And that is the roles, duties, and particularly elected terms for president and committee chairs. So how do people feel about that, having that conversation in December? We can squeeze it in. Okay. All right. Any other comments? So we have our list of, I think I don't need to repeat it. I think we have a pretty clear list of the things that we have asked to do. Mr. Klausner, I want to thank you very much for joining us today. Your commentary was very helpful.
All right.
And we probably will be having some further conversation. Thank you very much. Oh, and now is there any public, I will turn and see if there's any public comment for this meeting. Neil Johnson with SEIU 1000. Here's one right here. Is it Mike? Okay, all right. I have the official slip.
Unfortunately, I know that act too well, being on both sides of it. Thank you. Neil Johnson, SEIU 1000. Not quite sure what to say, but because there's part of a number of issues I think you're struggling with, and as a stakeholder, I'm sort of pondering but the issue of number of times do you meet? It's something I've thought about a number of times because, I'm lucky that I work in downtown Sacramento, live close, relatively, although traffic some days is horrible in the morning. But I can attend these, but people who don't live here have that struggle. But so in one sense, it might be nice not to meet as often. But then you start having, I'm not sure it really saves staff resources because, say you meet every 2 months, do you really have less work, or have you just changed the pattern of that work and the timing of things, and you maybe instead of having smaller sized items, you have larger sized items, and I'm not sure there's particularly any economy of scale to those. So I don't really have an answer, but I think it's a real thing. You got to, how you do that becomes very important. It also, how do you deliver or deal with the members of the system who desire some input into the decisions if you meet less frequently, and some of it takes on behalf of us a lot of work to decide where we want to go in a position and sometimes crunch the numbers, and so it's goes both ways. In one sense, like I said, I'd love to meet less often because my boss certainly would like me to be at the state job a little more frequently than I am, but it's I haven't come up with a specific answer. I think it is a real good thing to think about. I don't want to think of we're going to go to a quarterly and have a week-long meeting because I think it would just kill you. So anyway, I think it's something, and I will try to think about it, and next month have some comments.
Good. Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for your commentary. And with that, this meeting is adjourned.
Hello, Mr. Chairman and board members.